I have served the Concordance for 412 of your years. I have filed the surrender of 3 empires. I watched the Veil fleets burn over Orissa and did not blink, because blinking is not permitted to an archivist on duty. I am not a brave creature. My people, the Seleth, are not built for bravery. We are built for memory. And of everything I have ever recorded, there is only one day I cannot say out loud without my throat going dry. It was the day a Thren officer struck a human child on the steps of the gates of convening. I was standing close enough to hear the sound it made. You think you know what happened that day. You have heard the version the broadcasts gave you, clean, tidy, a diplomatic incident resolved through proper channels. That is the lie we agreed to tell, all of us, because the truth was too large to carry through a doorway. Let me tell you the truth. I was there. I held the record. I have thought often about why it should be me who carries this. I'm not the right creature for it. I told you Seleth are not built for the large feelings. We are built to file, to keep, to set a thing down exactly as it happened, and never let our own small heart bend the shape of it. That is our gift, and it is our curse. I have stood at the edge of beautiful things and terrible things alike, and felt only the cool, clean need to record them correctly. But that day reached past all of that. It reached into the part of me I did not know I had. And I have come to believe that is the whole point of telling it, that if a creature like me, a creature made of memory and caution and nothing warmer, could be changed forever by what happened on those steps, then perhaps anyone can. Perhaps you can. Perhaps that is why I have finally decided to speak it aloud, here, now, before my time runs out and the only copy of it left is the cold one in the archive that no one ever reads. So the gates. You have to understand the gates first, otherwise none of it will land the way it landed on us. The gates of convening are not really gates. They are the front of the Great Hall on Ethon Reach, the station world where the Concordance meets, where 209 species send their voices to be counted. The gates are a wall of pale stone, quarried from a dead moon, older than most of the species who walk past it, and set into that wall are doors 300 spans high, carved with the seals of every founding world. In front of the gates there is a plaza. We call it the forecourt. It is wide enough to land a freighter on, though no one ever would, and the floor is a single sheet of dark glass that holds the light of the station's fall sky like still water holds the moon. Every delegation that wishes to address the Concordance must cross the forecourt on foot. No transports, no escorts beyond a fixed number. You walk it yourself in the open where everyone can see you. That is the law, and the law is older than the building. It is meant to say a simple thing. Here, no one is above being seen. On the morning I am telling you about, the forecourt was crowded. There was a ceremony, the formal seating of 3 new member worlds, and so the delegations had come in their best, and the species who like to watch such things had come to watch, and there were vendors at the edges selling sweet ices and prayer tokens and little glass copies of the gates for children to take home. The air smelled of 100 different perfumes and at least 4 kinds of incense, and under all of it, faint, the cold mineral smell of the dark glass floor. It was, in short, an ordinary good day, the kind of day where nothing happens. I was at my station near the lower steps with my recording shells laid out, taking the formal entries as delegations arrived. It is dull work. I love dull work. Dull work means no one has died. And then the humans came. You have to remember that this was early. Humans had been part of the Concordance for barely a generation by their counting, less than nothing by ours. Most of us had never stood close to one. We knew them the way you know a thing from stories by its reputation, which is always either too large or too small and never the right size. And the reputation of humans was this single, ugly word that had spread through the Concordance like a stain: Deathworlders. I should explain it because the broadcasts you grew up with have made it sound almost fond, almost a compliment. It was not a compliment when I first heard it. It was a warning. You see, when the survey crews first found Earth, they thought it was a mistake. The gravity was high. The atmosphere was thick with corrosive oxygen. The world was crawling with things that could kill you. Predators with teeth, plants with poison, storms that could lift a building. Diseases so numerous the surveyors gave up cataloging them. And the water was full of life that ate other life, all the way down. By every standard the concordance used, Earth should have been a sterile rock or a graveyard. Worlds like that, high gravity, high hazard, high death, we have a name for, Deathworlds. And the old rule that every survey crew knows in its bones is that nothing complex evolves on a death world. The world kills it first. It kills it in the cradle. Earth broke the rule. Not only had something complex evolved there, something had evolved that thrived there. Something that took the high gravity and used it to grow dense, fast muscle. Something that took the predators and learned to hunt them back. Something that took the diseases and built a body that could fight a war against the invisible every single day of its life and win mostly, and keep walking even when it lost. Something that could run for longer than any prey on its world could flee, not because it was faster, but because it would simply not stop. It would chase a thing across the burning open ground until the thing's heart gave out, and then it would walk home and tell its young about it. That was the human, a predator from a world that ate the weak before they could draw breath, and it had not only survived, it had climbed to the top, and then it had looked up at the stars and decided that was not far enough. When the first human delegation arrived at the concordance, a Thren marshal, and remember the Thren, because the Thren matter to this story, a Thren marshal stood up and said, plainly, that humans should not be admitted. Not because they were dangerous in the way a fleet is dangerous. Plenty of species had fleets. He said it for a different reason. He said, you are inviting the desert wolf to sit at the table because it learned to speak. It has not stopped being the wolf. I filed that statement. I remember the exact angle of his jaw when he said it. And the human envoy, the first one, not the one in my story, the human envoy stood up, and everyone braced, because we all expected the wolf to show its teeth. Instead, the human said, very quietly, we learned to speak so we wouldn't have to be the wolf. Give us the chance to keep our word. And the concordance, in its wisdom or its fear, admitted them. That is the world you have to picture. A galaxy full of species who had been told, over and over, that the humans were a beautiful disaster waiting to happen. A galaxy that watched humans the way you watch a fire someone has invited into your house, grateful for the warmth, never quite turning your back. And the humans knew it. That is the part most of us missed. They knew exactly how we looked at them. They had been looking at us looking at them for a generation. And they had decided, every single one of them, it seemed, by some agreement none of us were party to, that they would be the most polite, most patient, most painfully careful species in the concordance. That they would never, ever give us the excuse. I used to think that was weakness. I was a fool. The human delegation that morning was small. 5 of them, which was all the law allowed for the ceremony. There was the envoy. His name was Daniel Reyes. I had filed him before, a steady creature, gray coming into the dark fur on his head, with eyes that always seemed to be doing arithmetic behind them. He moved slowly for a human, deliberately, the way I would learn they all moved when they were among us. Soft, careful, always with their hands visible. I came to understand later that this was a courtesy. They had noticed, somewhere in that first generation, that quick human movement frightened the rest of us. So they had slowed themselves down. An entire species had agreed to move gently in our presence, the way you would lower your voice in a room where someone is sleeping. There was a colonel beside him, Aisha Demir, the escort commander. I want you to hold on to her because she does almost nothing in this story, and that nothing is the loudest thing in it. She was not large for a human. They came in many sizes, and she was on the smaller end, but there was a quality to how she stood. She stood like the floor belonged to her, and she was choosing to let the rest of us use it. She wore the dark gray of the human outwatch, the soldiers who guarded their envoys, and her eyes never stopped moving, and they never moved fast. There were two more soldiers behind her. One I would later know as Sergeant Bram Holloway, a wide creature, scarred across the throat. The other I never learned the name of, and I am sorry for that because of what he did. And there was the child. Her name was June. She was 7 of their years, which is very young. Humans are helpless for a long time, longer than most, another thing that should have killed them and somehow didn't. She was the envoy's daughter. There had been some long argument, I was told later, about whether she should come at all, and the envoy had won it by saying that if humans were ever going to be trusted, our children had to see each other, and the galaxy had to see our children. He believed that. He believed it the way you believe a thing you have decided to die for if you have to. She was wearing a blue dress. I remember the blue. It was the exact blue of the deep ocean on the human homeworld, the kind of blue that does not exist anywhere on a world like mine. She had 2 small braids, and she was holding her father's hand, and she was staring at everything. The gates, the dark glass floor, a vendor's float of colored ices, the crested heads of the Vothan delegation. A child seeing the whole galaxy for the first time, all of it new, all of it enormous. And here is the thing I cannot forget. When she caught a creature looking at her, and many were, because a human child was a rare and unsettling sight, she did not flinch. She smiled. A small, gap-toothed smile, the kind that means nothing and everything. She smiled at a Vothan warrior twice her father's height, and the Vothan, who eats things larger than that child for its morning meal, went very still and then very slowly dipped its crest at her. A salute. To a cub. I filed that too, without thinking. Human child acknowledged by Vothan principle. Such a small line. I had no idea what I was writing. There was one more thing the child did before any of it, and I have never told anyone. And I am going to tell you now because you deserve to know exactly what was lost and almost lost on that floor. The iron, the small frightened people I told you about, the ones Val had shamed, they had a child with them. I had not noticed at first. The young of the iron are kept close, wrapped in the body folds of the adults, because they are fragile and the galaxy is large. But the old one's shame had rattled the whole delegation, and somewhere in the rattling the child had slipped loose, and it had wandered a little way off, the way young things do, and it had ended up near the edge of the forecourt, alone, its frills fluttering, lost in a forest of legs belonging to species that could crush it without noticing. It was making a sound, a small, high, frightened sound, and not one of us moved toward it because that is the truth about the concordance. We are very good at not seeing the small, frightened thing. We have made an art of it. It is practically a founding principle. June saw it. She was still holding her father's hand then, and she pulled. I saw it. I saw the small pull, and her father looked, and saw the lost iron child, and made a decision that I think tells you everything about why humans terrify me, and why I would, if it came to it, choose to stand with them against my own better judgment for the rest of my days. He let her go to it. He did not let her go alone. He went with her, the envoy of all humanity. He crouched down low so as not to loom, and his daughter walked up to the lost iron child very slowly, the way you approach a frightened thing, and she crouched too, and she put out one small human hand, palm up, empty, and she waited. And the iron child, after a long terrified moment, put one of its small fluttering frill fingers against her palm. And June smiled at it, and she said something I could not hear, and she walked it back slowly, carefully, holding its frill finger in her hand the whole way. She walked it back across that vast and terrible forecourt to its own people, and she gave it back to the pale old iron whose frills were still flat with shame. And she said something to him, too, and the old one looked at this human cub in her ocean blue dress, as if she were a thing he had heard about in stories and never believed was real. Then she went back to her father and took his hand again, and that was all. It took perhaps the length of 100 breaths. No one applauded. No one filed it but me, and I filed it wrong. I filed it as minor delay, human delegation, because I did not yet have the words for what I had seen. I have the words now. What I had seen was the entire difference between the humans and the rest of us, laid out on the dark glass in the space of 100 breaths. We saw the small, frightened thing and looked away. The Deathworld animal's cub saw it and went to it. That is the child Coran Val struck. Not just any child. That child. The one who, minutes before, had been the only creature in the forecourt kind enough to carry a frightened stranger home. I think about that more than anything else. More than the blow. More than what came after. I think about the fact that of all the children in all the galaxy, the one he chose to call an animal and knock to the ground was the one who had just proven herself the most civilized creature any of us had ever seen. Now I have to tell you about the one who hurt her, and I will be fair, because an archivist is fair or he is nothing. I will tell you who he was and how he came to be the kind of creature who could do what he did. His name was Coran Val. He was a sub-marshal of the Thren. The Thren are an old people, older than humans by an amount that has no useful name. They are tall and armored, plated like the things that live at the bottom of the human ocean, and they have ruled and lost and ruled again so many times that they have come to believe rule is simply their natural condition, the way water believes in flowing downhill. They are not cruel as a people. I want to be careful here. Most Thren I have known are rigid and proud and tiresome and entirely honorable. They keep their word past the point of sense. There is much to admire in them. But there is a sickness that gets into old people sometimes, and it had gotten into Coran Val. The sickness of believing that age is the same as worth. That because his line was old, he was high, and because he was high, the things below him were not quite real. They were furniture that happened to move, obstacles that happened to have faces. And humans were the lowest of all in his arithmetic. Newcomers, Deathworld animals, things that had no business at the table, that had been let in by soft councils too cowardly to keep them out. He had said as much, in places where he thought only his own kind were listening. I know, because the archive hears everything eventually. He was the officer of the gate that morning. A ceremonial post, mostly. The Thren liked to provide the gate marshals for great convenings. It was an honor, and they were good at standing very still and looking permanent. His job was to manage the flow of delegations across the forecourt, to keep the lines clean, to make sure no one crossed the inner threshold before they were called. A small job, a nothing job, the kind of job where nothing happens. I will tell you a thing that happened that same morning, before the humans ever crossed the forecourt, because it tells you who Coran Val was better than any description I could write. There is a small people called the Iron. You will not have heard of them. There are very few of them left, and they are quiet, and they keep to the edges of things. They are small, smaller than I am, and soft-bodied, and they breathe through frills along their necks that flutter when they are frightened. They had come to the convening to ask the Concordance for help. Their homeworld star was dying faster than the old charts had promised, and they had come, hat in hand as the humans would say, to beg for a place to put their people before the cold took them. A delegation of 3 Iron crossed the forecourt that morning ahead of the humans. They moved the way the desperate move, too fast and too slow at once, eager to please, terrified of giving offense. And one of them, an old one, his frills already gone pale with age, stumbled on the lower step. He did not fall. He only stumbled, put out a hand, caught himself against the edge of the inner threshold. The same metal line, you understand. The same sacred line, and steadied himself. His hand crossed it, for perhaps 2 heartbeats, an old creature catching his balance. Coran Val looked down at him, and he said, in the flat Thren voice that carries without ever being raised, "The threshold is not a crutch for beggars." That was all. He did not strike the Iron. The Iron was not worth striking. He simply said it in front of everyone, and the old creature's frills went white as bone and folded flat against his neck, and his 2 companions gathered him up and hurried him on, and the whole small delegation crossed the rest of the forecourt as if they were trying to disappear, as if they could fold themselves small enough that the galaxy would forget it had seen them shamed. I filed it. Iron delegation rebuked by gate marshal at threshold. One line. I remember thinking, with the small cold part of an archivist that is always taking notes even on its own feelings. I remember thinking, that was unkind and unnecessary, and no one will ever do anything about it, because the iron are small and the thread are old, and that is how the concordance works. I tell you this so that when I tell you what Vol did to the child, you do not imagine it came from nowhere. It did not come from nowhere. It came from a creature who had spent a long life learning that the small can be stepped on and the old will be forgiven for stepping. He had been proven right 10,000 times. The iron had proven him right that very morning. The humans were about to prove him wrong. He had 4 of his own soldiers with him, plated like he was, and a ceremonial blade at his hip that I do not think had been drawn in his lifetime. He stood at the foot of the inner steps with his arms folded behind his back, and he watched the delegations come, and there was on his face, I could see it from my station, there was a particular expression. The expression of a creature being made to wait among things he considers beneath him. When the humans crossed the forecourt, I watched that expression change. It got worse. It got the careful, polished contempt that the very old put on for the very new. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply looked at them the way you would look at mud someone had tracked into a temple. The humans saw it. Of course they saw it. They saw everything. The envoy's pace did not change. The colonel's eyes touched Vol once, the way a blade touches a whetstone just to know where he was and then moved on. They had been looked at like that 1,000 times. It cost them nothing anymore. They reached the inner steps. The envoy presented his seal. Vol took it slowly, examined it longer than he needed to, the way a creature does when it wants you to know that it could refuse, that the only reason it is not refusing is its own great generosity. He handed it back. He stood aside the smallest amount the law would let him. It was, until then, only rudeness. The concordance is built on a foundation of swallowed rudeness. We are very good at it. The humans were better at it than any of us. It should have ended there. I want you to feel the waiting, because the waiting is where the whole thing lived before it broke. The ceremony inside was running long. The forecourt was full and getting fuller, and the false sky overhead had shifted into its midday color, a warm gold that the dark glass floor threw back up at us so that the whole plaza seemed lit from below as much as above. The incense had thickened. Somewhere a Vathan honor drum had begun its slow ceremonial pulse, the deep one you feel in your chest plates more than here. Delegates were murmuring, shifting, doing the small restless things that thinking creatures do when they are made to stand and wait in their finest dress with nowhere to sit. And the humans waited better than any of us. I had noticed this about them before, but never so clearly as that morning. The colonel stood with her weight even, her hands loose, her eyes moving in that slow, constant sweep. The 2 soldiers behind her had folded into the kind of stillness that looks like rest and is not rest at all. I know that now. The envoy stood with one hand resting on his daughter's shoulder, and he was talking to her low, pointing out things across the forecourt, nomming the species for her, teaching her the galaxy one delegation at a time. That one's a Vathan, see the crest. Those small ones near the pillar, those are Selith. They keep all the records, they remember everything. I did not hear him say it. I am guessing. But I would like to believe he pointed at my people and told her we remember everything, because we do, and because I have tried very hard to be worthy of it ever since. Coran Vol watched them wait, and I think their patience offended him almost as much as their existence did. There is a kind of creature that cannot stand to be in the presence of dignity it did not grant. Every moment the human stood there, calm and courteous and entirely unbothered by his contempt, was a moment he was not being given the thing he believed he was owed, which was their fear. So he kept finding small ways to remind them where they stood. He made the envoy hold the seal a moment too long. He gestured them back from the step a hand's width more than the law required. Petty things, pinpricks. The humans absorbed each one without a flicker, which only made the next one come faster. And the child, June, grew bored. Of course she did. She was 7. The galaxy is only astonishing for so long before a child's eye goes looking for the one bright thing in all of it, and the one bright thing for her was the fountain of light. The delegation paused on the lower step. There was a wait. The ceremony inside had not yet cleared the threshold, so they waited in the open on the steps where the law puts everyone. And the child let go of her father's hand. That is all. She was 7. There was a fountain to one side of the steps, not water. The Thren do not waste water on display, but a slow pour of light, a cold blue-white light that ran down a column of dark stone and pooled at the bottom and rose again endlessly like a waterfall made of moonlight. It was beautiful. I had stopped seeing it years before. She had never seen anything like it in her life. She let go of her father's hand, and she walked toward the light. It was 3 steps, 4. A child's wandering. The envoy turned the instant she moved. Humans are fast when they need to be, faster than they ever let us see, and he said her name, not sharply, gently, June. The way you call a child back without scaring her. She heard it. She was already turning back, already smiling, already lifting her hand toward the light to show her father the beautiful thing, the look at this of every child on every world. But to do it, she had crossed a line. There is a line of inlaid metal in the floor of the forecourt, near the steps. It marks the inner threshold, the place past which no delegation may step until they are called. It is a sacred line, in the way that lines drawn by the powerful are always called sacred. It is also nearly invisible. It is a thin band of dull metal in a floor of dark glass, and a creature who had grown up on Ethan Reach would know it the way you know the edge of your own doorstep, and a 7-year-old from a blue and green world 1,000 light-years away would not know it at all. She crossed it by half a step, reaching for the light. And Coran Val moved. I want to be careful. I am the record. I must be exact. He did not warn her. He did not speak. He did not look to her father, who was already 2 steps toward her, hand already out, the word June already a second time in his mouth. A reasonable creature, a creature with the smallest particle of patience, would have done any of 100 things. Said the child must not cross. Raised a hand. Waited the half-breath it would have taken for the father to reach her. Coran Val did none of those things, because to him she was not a child. She was a Deathworld animal's cub that had soiled a sacred floor, and the old reflex of his old blood told him that the thing to do with an animal that crosses where it should not is to correct it. He struck her. It was the back of his hand, armored. He was 3 times her height and many times her weight, and he was strong even for a Thren, and he swung the back of his armored hand at the side of a 7-year-old child's head with enough force that the sound of it, I told you I was close enough to hear it. The sound of it was not loud. That is the thing no one believes. It was not a great crash. It was a small, wet, terrible crack, like a green branch breaking, and it cut straight through all the perfume and the incense and the murmur of 1,000 delegates. And after it, there was a sound I had never heard in the forecourt before. There was no sound at all. The child went down. She did not fly through the air the way violence happens in stories. She simply dropped, folded, the way small things drop, and her head struck the dark glass, and the blue dress pooled around her, and there was blood at her mouth and her ear, a thin bright line of human red on the black floor, and she did not move. For one heartbeat the entire forecourt, 200 species, 10,000 creatures stood in absolute silence. I could hear the fountain of light. I could hear my own shells humming. I could hear, somewhere far off, a vendor's float still playing its little tune to no one. And then I looked at the humans. This is the part I have never been able to file properly. There is no protocol for it. There is no word in the concordance tongue for what I saw on those 5 faces in that one heartbeat. And I have searched. I have spent years searching, and the closest I have come is a human word they taught me much later, and even it is not enough. The word is stillness. Not calm, calm is soft. This was not soft. It was the stillness of a thing that has decided. It was the stillness of the moment after the lightning and before the thunder, when the whole sky is holding what it is about to do. It was the stillness of the desert wolf the Thren Marshal had warned us about, the wolf that chases its prey across the burning ground until the prey's heart gives out. And I understood, in that heartbeat in my bones, in the 400 years of memory I carry, that the wolf had never gone away. It had been standing among us the entire time, patient, polite, moving gently so as not to frighten us, and we had mistaken its patience for tameness. The envoy Daniel Reyes had stopped, one step from his daughter, his hand still out. His face had gone to that stillness, and it was the most frightening thing I have ever seen on a living creature, because there was nothing in it. No rage, no grief yet, just a vast and total emptiness, like a door had closed somewhere behind his eyes, and on the other side of that door was every terrible thing his death world had ever built into him, all of it awake. The two soldiers behind the colonel had moved. I did not see them move. One instant they were 3 steps back, and the next they were forward, low, and there were weapons in their hands, not raised, not yet, but in their hands, and the safety tones of the weapons had gone silent, which meant they were live. And the one whose name I never learned had his weapon's mouth tracking Coran Val across the small distance with a steadiness that no fear and no anger should allow. Val's 4 soldiers had moved too, raising their own arms, and his guard had stepped half in front of him. And for one instant the forecourt held 2 lines of the armed facing each other over the body of a child. And I, who have filed 3 wars, knew with total certainty that I was about to watch the 4th begin, here, on the steps, in front of the gates, and that it would not stop here, that it would run up through the Thren and the humans and pull in every alliance and grudge in the concordance. And that when it was over there might not be a concordance at all. I have never been so afraid. I want you to know that. I, who do not feel bravery, felt the absence of it so completely that I could not move my own limbs. And then the colonel spoke. Aisha Demir had not moved. That is what I keep coming back to. Everyone else had moved, the soldiers, Val's guard, the delegates already shrinking back, the whole forecourt bracing, and the colonel had not moved at all. She stood exactly where she had been standing. And into that silence, in a voice that was not loud, that was almost quiet, that I should not have been able to hear from where I stood and yet heard with total clarity, she said one word. She said, "Hold." That was all, "hold." And her 2 soldiers, the ones already low, already tracking, already one twitch from ending the sub-marshal's life and starting the war, her 2 soldiers held. I cannot explain to you what that cost. I have seen warriors of every species, and I have never seen anything like the cost of that holding. The one whose name I never learned, the one tracking Val, I was close enough to see his hands. They were not shaking. That is the wrong thing to say. A shaking hand is a hand losing control. His hands were steady the way a dam is steady, the way a thing under impossible pressure is steady right up until the instant it is not, and you can feel the knot coming. His weapon stayed on Val. His finger stayed off the trigger, and every muscle in that human's body was screaming to do the thing his blood had built him to do, which was to kill the creature that had struck the cub of his pack, and he did not do it. Because his colonel had said hold. I learned later what they were. Those 2 soldiers. They were not ordinary outwatch. They were something the humans called close protection, the ones who stand nearest the children of envoys, the ones chosen for exactly the moment when every instinct in a human body would demand blood, because they were the ones who could be trusted not to take it. They had been chosen for their stillness. They had trained for years for the one instant in which they would have to not avenge a child while looking at the child. I did not know any of that standing there. I only knew that I was watching 2 predators decline to kill, and that the declining was somehow more terrifying than the killing would have been, because it meant they could have, easily, and had simply chosen the harder thing instead. Coran Val, I think, did not understand what he was looking at. I have thought about this a great deal. I think in that moment he saw the humans hold their weapons and he read it as fear, as submission, as the low-born animal cowering, finally, before its betters, because that is what his arithmetic told him it must be. A creature like Val cannot imagine restraint. He can only imagine weakness wearing restraint's clothes. He looked at the colonel and at the held weapons and the contempt on his face. I swear this on the archive. The contempt deepened. He thought he had won. And then the envoy knelt down and picked up his daughter. I will tell you the rest. But not yet. The kneeling is where part one has to end, because the kneeling is the hinge of the whole thing, and you should sit with it the way I have had to sit with it for all these years. Daniel Reyes knelt on the dark glass in front of the gates of convening, in front of 200 species, in front of the creature that had just struck his child, and he gathered June up into his arms. He did it slowly. He did it gently. He put one hand under her head where the blood was, and he lifted her against his chest, and her braids hung down, and the blue dress hung down, and she was so small against him, so terribly small. And he did not look at Cora and Val. That was the thing. That was the thing that made my old heart stop. He had every reason to look at the sub-marshal, to scream at him, to curse him, to promise him death. And Daniel Reyes did not give him one particle of his attention. He knelt in the silence with his hurt child in his arms, and he looked down at her face, and he said, so quietly that I think only she and I and perhaps the colonel heard it. He said, I've got you, baby. Daddy's got you. You're okay. You're okay. And then June, who had not moved, whose blood was on the black floor, whose father had every reason to believe the worst, June opened her eyes. She was alive. And the whole forecourt, which had been holding one single breath for what felt like the length of a war, let it out at once, a sound like wind through the gates, and in that sound was the first edge of something enormous beginning to turn. But June, looking up at her father with blood on her mouth, with the side of her small face already swelling dark, June did the thing that I will carry until the day my memory and I are filed away together forever. She lifted one small hand, and she touched her father's face, and in a voice no bigger than a thread, looking at the stillness in him, at the terrible closed door behind his eyes, she said, Daddy, don't. 2 words from a child to the most dangerous creature in the forecourt. Daddy, don't. And I watched Daniel Reyes, envoy, father, Deathworlder, the wolf the Thren had warned us about. I watched him close his eyes, and I watched the door behind them strain, and I did not know in that moment which way it would open. That is where I have to stop, because what happened next is the reason I cannot tell this story without my throat going dry, and I need you to understand the silence before I tell you about the thunder. The humans had held, the child had spoken, and Coran Val, fool that he was, still thought he had won. He was about to learn what the rest of us were only beginning to suspect. That the most dangerous thing in the galaxy is not a species that cannot be hurt. It is a species that can be hurt deeply, in the one place that matters most, and chooses, with everything it has, not to make you pay the price its blood is screaming for. Until the moment it decides the price must be paid after all. Daddy, don't. I left you there at the end of the last telling, and I am sorry for it, but you needed to feel the held breath before I let it go. The child had spoken. Her small hand was on her father's face, and Daniel Reyes knelt on the dark glass with his closed eyes and his straining shut door, and the whole forecourt waited to see which way the door would open. Here is what I have never been able to make anyone understand about that moment. The choice was not his. Not really. Oh, the decision was his, whether to let his blood out or hold it in. But the thing he was deciding about, the wolf, the Deathworld animal his whole species had spent a generation putting on a leash and walking gently among us, that thing was awake now, and it was looking at the creature who had hurt its cub, and every law of every world that has ever grown teeth says that what happens next is not a choice at all. It is the oldest thing in the universe. You touch the young, you die. That is older than language. It is older than fire. And Daniel Reyes held it, with his daughter's small, bloody hand on his cheek, with her thread of a voice saying, don't. He held the oldest thing in the universe in his 2 human hands, and he did not let it out. He opened his eyes. And he stood up, slowly, with June in his arms, and he turned not toward Coran Val, still not toward Val. The man would not give him that. He turned toward the gates, toward the concordance, toward the 200 species seated inside who made the law. And in a voice that was perfectly level, perfectly clear, a voice with the stillness still in it but harnessed now, pointed, aimed, he said the thing that changed everything. He said, I am invoking the right of witness. Open the gates. I have to explain the right of witness, because you will not understand the size of what he did otherwise. The concordance has very few old laws that bind every species without exception. Most of what we do is negotiation, custom, the slow grinding compromise of 200 peoples who do not agree on anything. But there are a handful of bedrock laws, older than the building, that cannot be voted away or argued around, and the right of witness is one of them. It is this: if a creature believes a wrong has been done that the ordinary channels will bury, that the powerful will smother, that the procedures will quietly lose, that creature may invoke the right of witness, and demand that the wrong be heard not in a chamber, not in committee, but at the open gates, in front of the full-seated concordance in the sight of all. No delegation may refuse to convene for it. No marshal may bar the gates against it. It exists for exactly one purpose: to make a thing impossible to ignore. It is almost never invoked. It is considered a desperate act, a barbarian's act, the act of a people too weak to win through proper means, and so dragging their grievance into the daylight where the powerful cannot pretend it away. The old, high peoples look down on it. The Thren, especially, look down on it. To invoke the right of witness is to announce to the whole galaxy that you do not trust the system to be fair to you. Which, of course, is exactly what the humans were announcing, and exactly what was true. When Daniel Reyes said those words, holding his bleeding child, I watched the understanding move through the forecourt like a wave through grain, because everyone knew instantly what it meant. It meant there would be no quiet settlement. No discreet apology, no transfer of the officer to some distant post, no payment slip to the family, no joint statement regretting an unfortunate misunderstanding. The humans were not going to let it be made small. They were going to drag it up the steps and through the gates and lay it down bleeding in front of the entire seated galaxy and say, look at what you let happen. Look at it and decide who you are. And the gates, the great doors 300 spans high, the doors that open only for ceremony and law, the gates began to open. Because they had to. That is the whole point of the right. They had to. I want to tell you about the holding again, because while the gates ground open, the holding went on, and the holding is the true heart of this story. Coran Val's soldiers still had their weapons up. The two human close protection still had theirs in their hands, low, ready, off the trigger. The colonel had not moved, and in the time it took the gates to open, which is a long time, those doors are old and vast and slow. The two lines simply held, facing each other across the body-warm space where the child's blood was drying on the glass, and not one finger on either side moved a hair. You have not felt a silence like that. I hope you never do. And then a thing happened that I think very few of the watching delegates even noticed. But I noticed, because I notice everything. It is the only thing I am for. One of Coran Val's soldiers, a younger Thren, you could tell by the color still in the seams of his plating. One of his own soldiers began, very slowly, to lower his weapon. Not all the way, just a degree, just enough. He had looked across the gap, you see. He had looked at the two humans holding their fire over the body of a child, holding it because a small, quiet woman had told them to hold, and because a smaller, bleeding child had asked her father not to. And I think I cannot prove this, but I think that young Thren soldier understood what he was looking at before his sub-marshal did. I think he looked at that holding and felt, in whatever the Thren have for a soul, the first cold touch of the truth. That he was not standing across from frightened animals. That he was standing across from creatures who wanted, with everything in them, to kill him and his commander where they stood, and who were not doing it, and that the not doing was a discipline so far beyond his own that it made his raised weapon feel like a child's gesture. He lowered it a degree, and Coran Val saw him do it and snapped at him in the flat Thren voice, "Hold position," and the young one's weapon came back up. But it had happened, I had seen it, the first crack not in the humans, in the Thren. The gates opened fully, and Daniel Reyes carried his daughter through them. He did not run. I want you to picture it exactly. He walked slowly up the last of the steps and across the threshold. Across the very line his daughter had been struck for crossing. He carried her across it now in his arms, deliberately in front of everyone. And there was a meaning in that I do not have the words for, and into the great hall of the Concordance, into the full sight of the 200-seated species, with the blood on his shirt and his child against his chest, and the colonel walked at his shoulder, and the soldiers walked behind. And the whole human delegation passed through the gates and into the chamber, and the galaxy rose to look at them. I followed. I am the record. Where the record is needed, I go. I came up the steps on my old legs as fast as they would carry me, and I slipped through the gates behind the soldiers, and I took my place at the recording wall, and I set my shells and I began to capture it, and my hands, I am not ashamed to tell you, my hands were not steady. Inside, the chamber was a great bowl of seats rising on every side, 200 sections, every species in its place, and at the center a floor of pale stone where petitioners stand. Daniel Reyes carried June to the center of that floor, and he stood there, holding her, and he waited for the chamber to go quiet, which it did, faster than I have ever heard it. I want to tell you about the sound the chamber made as he carried her in, because it was not silence at first. At first it was the opposite. 200 species had been seated in there for the seating ceremony, deep in the slow, pleasant boredom of high ritual, and the gates had ground open in the middle of it for no reason any of them understood, and a human had walked in carrying a bleeding child. And the chamber had erupted, that low rising roar a great crowd makes when something has gone wrong, and no one yet knows what, questions in 100 tongues, the scrape of bodies rising in their seats to see, the Vathan honor drum faltering and dying mid-beat. And then Daniel Reyes reached the center of the floor and stopped and stood and did not say anything at all. He just stood there holding her and let them look. And the roar died. It died the way a fire dies when you take the air from it fast. From the edges inward, section by section, as each part of the chamber saw what the center of the chamber was holding. By the time the quiet reached the high seats, it was total. You could hear the medic's footsteps coming down from the gallery. You could hear, I swear it, the small wet sound of June's breathing. That is a thing humans understand that the rest of us, with all our oratory and our procedure, had never learned. That you do not always have to raise your voice. That sometimes the loudest thing you can do is carry the truth into the center of the room and set it down and let it speak for itself. And then a human medic came forward. They had medics, of course they did. Humans never go anywhere without someone trained to put the body back together. It is one of the deepest things about them. A human medic came down from the gallery where the rest of the small human staff had been seated, and she came to the center floor. And Daniel Reyes knelt and laid his daughter down on the pale stone, and the medic began to work on her there, in the center of the Concordance, in front of everyone. And that is what the galaxy saw. Not a fleet, not a threat, not a single weapon raised in that chamber. The galaxy saw a human man kneeling on the floor of the highest hall in 200 worlds, while a human woman pressed cloth to the head of a human child, and it saw the child's blood on the pale stone, and it had nowhere to look away to, because the right of witness had nailed its eyes open. The speaker of the Concordance, a Vathan that session, the crested giant who had saluted the child in the forecourt, though I do not think Reyes knew that, the speaker rose and asked the ancient question that the right of witness demands. Who brings witness, and against whom? And Daniel Reyes, kneeling beside his daughter, not rising, looked up and said, I am Daniel Reyes, envoy of humanity. I bring witness against Sub-Marshal Coran Val of the Thren, who struck my child for the crime of being 7 years old and reaching toward a light. I do not ask for his death. My people could take it. We are choosing not to. I ask for one thing only. I ask the concordance to say, out loud in front of everyone, whether my daughter is a child or whether she is an animal, because he called her an animal. He has called all of us animals in the dark, where he thought no one was filing it down. And here he looked for the first time directly at me, at the recording wall, at the Seleth with his shells. You file everything, he said, not unkindly, don't you? I did not know I was permitted to speak. I am not by custom. But the right of witness was open and the chamber was silent, and the envoy of humanity was looking at me and asking me a question, and I found that my voice came on its own, thin and old and shaking, and I said, I do. Then play it, he said. Play this morning from the forecourt, all of it. Don't stop at the blow. I played it. The chamber has a great display field above the center floor, and my shells fed into it, and I played the morning of the forecourt for the entire seated concordance, and I did not stop at the blow, because he had told me not to, and because it was the truth and I am the keeper of it. I played Coran Val shamming the old iron at the threshold. The threshold is not a crutch for beggars. I played the small white frills going flat with shame. The chamber watched. I played the lost iron child, alone in the forest of legs making its small frightened sound. I played June seeing it. I played her crouching and her open empty hand and the long terrible moment and the small frill finger reaching out to touch her palm. I played her walking the lost child home across that vast floor, holding its hand the whole way and giving it back to the pale old one whose frills were still flat. The chamber watched. Somewhere in the iron section, a sound went up, a high keening sound, and I did not know then what it meant, but I learned later. It was the sound the iron make when they are shown a kindness they did not believe their world still contained. And then I played the strike. I played it once at the speed it happened, and the sound of it, that small wet terrible crack, went through the chamber, and 200 species flinched as one body. And then, because the truth must be exact, I played it again, slowed, so that no one could tell themselves it had been an accident, a stumble, a reflex. So that everyone could see Coran Val look down at a child reaching for a light, and choose with all the time in the world to swing the back of his armored hand at her head. And then I stopped, and the chamber was silent. And in that silence, Coran Val made the last mistake of his life. Not his death, I told you, the humans did not take that, but the death of everything he was. He made it himself with his own mouth because creatures like him cannot help it. He stood in the Thren section, and he said to the whole concordance, in the flat proud voice that had never once been made to feel small, he said, The animal crossed the threshold. I corrected it. I will not apologize to a death world for handling its livestock. If you had wanted it to behave, you should not have let it off its world. I have filed many terrible things said in that chamber. I have never filed a silence like the one that followed. Because here is the thing that Coran Val, in 400 years of being old and high and right, had never once had to learn. There is a difference between a room that is afraid of you and a room that has just decided it is done with you. And they sound exactly alike. They are both silent, and a creature like Val cannot tell them apart because he has only ever heard the first one. He thought the silence was fear. He stood in it and let it feed him. It was not fear. It was the entire concordance looking at him, and at the slowed image still hanging in the display field, the child, the light, the armored hand, and at the other image beside it that I had not taken down, the human kneeling on the floor of the highest hall in the galaxy with his daughter's blood on him and his weapons holstered, saying, I do not ask for his death. My people could take it. We are choosing not to, looking at those two things side by side and understanding, all at once, all 200 of them. Which one of these was the animal? And then they began to speak, not all at once, one at a time, the way the chamber speaks when something has cracked it open. Avathan rose first. a war leader from the high seats, and said only that in his people's oldest law there was a single crime for which there was no defense and no forgiveness, and that crime was the striking of a young one who could not strike back, and that he had not expected, in his long life, to see it committed by anyone but his enemies, and that he was ashamed it had been committed by a marshal of the Concordance under its own gates while he sat and watched. A delegate of the SSA rose, the SSA, who almost never speak in full session, a cold and calculating people, traders, weighers of advantage, and the SSA said something I did not expect from them. The SSA said, "We have watched the humans for a generation, as all of you have. We have been waiting, as all of you have, for them to show us the thing we feared. We confess we had begun to believe it was coming. We were wrong. We have just watched the thing we feared arrive, and it was wearing Thren plating, and it was one of our own. The humans showed us only the leash. We will not forget which of us reached for blood and which of us reached for a child." And then the old iron rose, the same one, the one Val had shamed at the threshold that very morning, the one whose frills had gone white. He was very small in that great chamber, and his voice was thin, and he had to wait for the silence to come all the way down to him before he could be heard. And he said, "I have it word for word, I will have it forever." He said, "Submarshal Corin Val told me this morning that the threshold is not a crutch for beggars. He was right, it is not. I am a beggar. My world is dying and I came here to beg for my people's lives, and I expected nothing, because that is what beggars learn to expect. And then a child of the death world, who owed me nothing, who did not even know my name, carried my lost grandchild home through a crowd of giants because no one else in this entire concordance would. Not one of you. Not I, only her. So I will tell you what I have decided, standing here as a beggar. I would rather my dying people be counted among hers than among any of yours. That is my witness. That is all I have to give her, and I give it gladly." And he sat down, and the chamber did not make a sound. I think that was the moment it was truly over for Corin Val, not the verdict which had not yet come, that moment. When the smallest, lowest, most desperate creature in the hall stood up and chose the humans over all the old high peoples who had spent a generation looking down on them, and gave as his reason a single act of kindness from a 7-year-old child. The Vothan speaker rose, and the Vothan speaker, the crested giant, did a thing that has no precedent I have ever found in 400 years of records. He came down from the high seat, he crossed the center floor, and he knelt. The Vothan do not kneel, their bodies are barely built for it. It is a posture of such profound submission in their culture that I have only ever read of it in their oldest war songs, the kneeling of the defeated king. The Vothan speaker knelt on the pale stone beside the human child, beside the medic still working, and he lowered his great crested head until it nearly touched the floor, and he said, in the formal old tongue so that the record would have it forever, "This one carried my people's stranger home when we would not. I saw it. I who am called speaker looked away from a frightened child, and this 7-year-old Deathworlder did not. The shame is not hers. The shame is ours. The shame is mine." And then he rose, and he turned to the Thren section, and to Corin Val, and the kneeling was gone from him entirely, and what was in its place I will not try to name. "You called her livestock," the speaker said. "You stood in the highest hall of 200 worlds, and you called a child livestock, and you did it proudly where everyone could file it down. Submarshal Corin Val, the Concordance has heard the witness. Here is its answer." They stripped him. That is the short way to say it, but I will tell you the long way, because the long way is the whole point. They did not execute him. The humans had made that impossible, had made it, by their restraint, a thing the Concordance could not do without looking like the animal in the comparison. If the humans had killed him in the forecourt, the galaxy could have called them beasts and washed its hands. The humans had taken that exit away. They had walked their grievance up the steps and laid it down bleeding and holstered their weapons, and in doing so they had handed the entire weight of the thing to the Concordance and said, Now you have to be the ones to decide what kind of place this is. We won't do it for you with blood. You have to do it with your law in the daylight, and you have to mean it." And the concordance for once rose to it. They stripped Coron Val of his rank, every grade of it back to nothing. They stripped his line of its hereditary seat at the gate marshal's honor, which the Thren had held for longer than humans had been walking upright, so that no Thren would ever again stand at the gates of convening. The honor passed, by the speaker's decree, to the iron, to the small frightened people, to the kindness no one else had shown. And to this day it is an iron who marshals that gate, and they are gentle at it, and they help the old up the steps. They stripped Val of his name in the formal record, which to a Thren is a kind of death after death, the unmaking of the line itself, and they handed his person to the Thren's own internal justice, which, I will say this for the Thren, did not flinch from what their own had done. The Thren are rigid and proud and tiresome, and they keep their word past the point of sense, and when their word turned out to require them to break one of their own old high lines for the sake of a Deathworld child, they did it. It cost them, I watched it cost them, they did it anyway. There is much to admire in them. And through all of it, the stripping, the decree, the long formal unmaking, Coron Val stood in the Thren section and watched his 400 years come apart, and I watched his face, because that is my job, and I saw the exact moment the understanding finally reached him. It was not when they took his rank, it was not when they took his name. It was when he looked, one last time, at the human kneeling on the floor at Daniel Ray's, who through the whole proceeding had not once looked at him, who had given him nothing, not rage, not triumph, not even hatred, who had simply stayed beside his daughter the entire time with his hand on her hair. It was when Val looked at that and understood at last that the human had never been frightened of him, not for one instant, that the holding in the forecourt had not been submission, that the human could have killed him in the time it takes to say it, easily, the way you would put down a dangerous animal, and had simply chosen, out of a strength Val did not possess and could not imagine, not to. He had spent his whole life believing he was the High One, and the humans were the beasts. And he died not in body, but in every way that a creature like him can die. He died understanding that it had been exactly the other way around the entire time, that the beast had been merciful to him, and that mercy, from a thing that could have destroyed him, was the most complete defeat his old proud blood had ever known. There were two more things in the aftermath that I have to set down before I tell you what became of the child, because the day did not only end one creature, it began others, and a record that keeps only the ending is half a record. The young Thren soldier, the one who had lowered his weapon a single degree in the forecourt, the one Val had snapped back into line, he resigned his commission. He did it the very next day, formally, in writing in the old way, which among the Thren is a grave and near irreversible thing. And he came, alone and unarmored, to the human quarters, and he asked to be allowed to stand the watch outside June's recovery room, not as a soldier. He had no rank anymore. As a penitent. He asked to be allowed to guard the child his commander had struck, and to be given no weapon, and no pay, and no honor, for as long as the humans would permit him.